Hi, everyone. This is Arsalan, and this is my friend Leanne. And this is our first session in terms of. So, the idea behind this discussion is that Leanne and I are friends for a while. A few years, we used to work together in a clinical setting as psychotherapists. And then Leanne has moved out to BC 3 years ago, I guess.
Two. It's been 2 years this
Two
summer.
years. Okay. Okay. So it's been 2 years until Leanne retired from the hospital, and I kept working there. And we had a nice rapport in the hospital. Always used to look up to Leanne, and she was also there when I was first settling into the hospital. And it was a fairly intense clinical setting and needed a fair bit of hand holding in the beginning to get started. And even though I had experience as a psychotherapist before I got in there, and so we formed that relationship, and Leanne was always, quite helpful, always going to her room and knocking on her door if I had an issue, and appreciating the sort of the soft, gentle wisdom which was always present, and feeling held in that. And so once Leanne retired, and then she moved out to BC, and we kept in touch. And last year we reconnect, or not reconnected, but sort of more. I went to BC a few times for a shamanic healing course I was doing on Salt Spring, and that's where I spent some time with Leanne. And what we noticed was these discussions we used to have, or we have, when we are driving around or just hanging around in the living room, which seem to have a lot of richness and wisdom in terms of life in general, and just different topics around healing and life stories, and how to relate to our parents and media and all that. So since I left last summer, I was always thinking about these discussions, and how helpful they were to me, and if there was a way we could bring these discussions to a wider audience. Uh, so I kept thinking about it, and finally, a few weeks ago, I got a Zoom subscription and thought we'd give it a go and see how this goes.
See how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate Leanne's openness to trying this out. So then we thought we'd keep it quite casual in terms of what we talk about. And one thing I'm also, maybe we can start in, I'm curious about, so Leanne's been doing, one thing we talked about before we started this episode today was talking about a course Leanne is doing on eating disorders and eating issues. And I'm also curious about that course, because I think there's a lot there in terms of eating, and how food, just so much richness there, and but also interested in sort of this transition, Leanne, you've made to BC and starting over, and not over, but new place, because Leanne moved to a place which was totally, she didn't know, like I think you just knew one person. And I think taking this course and doing other things there has been part of this kind of settling into this place. And I'm just curious about this big life change you made, at an older age. And yeah, so just anything which comes to you, we could start there and
Yeah.
go from there.
And I'm just going to backtrack because when I think of how our friendship formed, one of the things that kind of stood out for me was COVID.
Hmm.
Because during COVID, I wasn't seeing a lot of people, but we did spend some time together. And that for me was meaningful.
Hmm.
I'm about to turn 72. So packing up and leaving a place I had lived for 20 years and had friendships was there was some challenges. There was is this something I should do or not? And at the same time, I had lived in BC before and loved it, and still had some really good friends here. So I thought it was worth giving it a try to see what happened. and I've ended up loving it. I'm really, really pleased with having made this move.
But didn't you sorry to jump in, because when you were leaving Peterborough, I noticed that they was getting ready to sell that house in a few months, and then you did it. But to me, my impression was that it wasn't a lot of trepidation. But I know people who were in their late 60s and 70s who would not do this move,
Mhm.
who would not do it. Period. Like they wouldn't even contemplate it. So what was different for you? You think that?
By the time I got to the point that I was selling the house, I had made up my mind. So that internal questioning wasn't there anymore. That came a little earlier.
Hmm.
I think there's some really good things about Peterborough. At the same time, it wasn't a good place for me. Um, I never really settled in. I always kind of had one foot out the door, hoping to get back to BC. So the decision wasn't terribly difficult. The other thing that happened was what kept me in that area was family. And family were moving to Alberta. And I didn't particularly want to go to Alberta,
You didn't
although
you didn't want to go to Alberta?
I didn't want to go to Alberta, although it's wonderful. They're having a just a great time. Um,
And what can I ask? Why didn't you want to go to Alberta?
they're in a small community. They're in a community of about maybe 5,000. And I thought there'd be nothing there for me. Like they're there because there's grandchildren and there's the mountains and activity, and there was purpose in their going there. For me, there wouldn't have been.
Mhm.
Um, and it just yeah, I couldn't see there was nothing I would have been looking forward to. It's a little small town and not much going on, and um
But BC always called you back in a way. There was
always
something,
did. Always did.
and you weren't concerned about feeling lonely or just because I mean, moving to a new town, even at a young age, people are hesitant.
Yeah. I leaving Ontario, I had a certain mindset, and it was that I was going to do this new place differently than I had done where I was. Like part of the issue with being in that town and why it didn't work for me was I really hadn't made much of an effort. Um, I had been what took me back to Ontario was my mother was really ill. So I went back to help take care of her. And after spending 2 years with her at the end of her life, I was exhausted. I was really tired and not really interested in building a life. Then I got a job at the hospital. I got into grad school, and work and school combined for quite a few years. So again, social life wasn't a priority. Plus, there was family there that I was spending time with and connecting with some of the people at work. So I just never really made an effort. It
Mm,
it it just kind of drifted until it got to the point that yeah, I wasn't happy there. So
mm,
I was glad when my family decided to move and they
mm.
were going to Alberta. I thought I can go to BC. So yeah, I was looking forward to it, and it was a good decision.
Right.
It was a really good decision.
Yeah. You packed up your car and drove across the country, pretty much to
Yeah,
Nanaimo. And
yeah. And I had a friend here, um, who I stayed with for a while I was looking for a place. At my age, I wouldn't have gone somewhere I didn't know anyone.
right.
Like that wouldn't, I don't think that would have been wise, but I had a good friend here.
Right.
So that felt really comfortable.
And also financially, you were able to do it, get a pension, and
Well, and very, very fortunate. I'm so grateful for that pension. I know not everyone has that, and it's made things a lot of things possible that wouldn't have been. Plus selling the house, the timing was good, and um so yeah, it's all those pieces came together. It's been interesting being here. I love the island. I just think it's beautiful, and the whole area. Um, it also feels in some ways like where I'm meant to be. Um, I had been here about 6 months, and I Googled a friend that I knew in my 20s that had lived north on the island. And I thought I found her, and I thought, well, I'll contact her. 2 days later, I got an email from her after 40 years.
because
She
this
had
was, and you hadn't contacted her,
hadn't
which,
con we had had
wow,
no contact.
amazing.
But she was thinking of going back for a visit to Ontario and thought she'd look me up, thinking that's where I was.
Mhm.
So we've reconnected after 40 years, which is kind of amazing. And then I had another friend when I was in Vancouver, and we hadn't been in touch for about 25 years, and through a number of circumstances, we've reconnected.
Mhm.
So the island is feeling very friendly, I feel at home here. I've got people that I've got long-standing friendships with, and it just feels good. One of the other things when I thought about moving here was, again, given my age, and weight has been an issue for me for most of my life, um, health concerns, and also
Okay.
wanting to make that a real focus. Um, Addictions have played a role in my life. So at 20, 25, 26, I was drinking a bottle of wine every day by myself, plus taking alcohol to parties, and it was the 70s. So there was marijuana, um and it became a problem. It became a worry. So I was drinking every day, and I was drinking every day for over a year. Um, and doing the games you play with yourself in your head. Like I had to buy wine just in case somebody dropped in. And then at the end of the night it would be gone. And so the next day the same thing. I was rolling joints at breakfast, so they would be there when I got home at night. Smoking, you could smoke anywhere, in offices, on buses. So I was smoking about 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day, and was developing quite a cough. Probably 10 to 12 cups of coffee. The job I had was taking me in and out of people's homes, and everybody was offering coffee, and um, it was kind of rude not to accept. So it was, and
And
then,
this was in Vancouver or Ontario?
oh, this was in Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah, this was in my my 20s, early to mid 20s when I worked in Toronto. Um, and then the food on top of that. So bit by bit, I've kind of worked my way through those issues. Um, Part of moving west the first time was I quit drinking and drugs. And I knew I wouldn't be able to do that with my peer group. Um, the friends I had, that was what we did together. And I knew that if I stayed if I'd stayed in Toronto, I wouldn't have been able to I wouldn't have been able to be around people and not be participating. So that was part of my motivation for moving west. Um, so I dealt with the alcohol and the drugs. The coffee took care of itself. It just over time, there wasn't an intent with that. Um, the cigarettes were really difficult to quit. That was I think the hardest in some ways. My mom developed lung cancer. She wasn't a smoker, but she developed lung cancer. So when I was going back to be with her at the end of her life, and this is kind of it's not that great, but my thinking was going to Ontario, I'm going to be miserable because I'll be out smoking in a blizzard, or I'm going to be miserable because I've quit. But either way, I'm going to be miserable. So I figured I was better off quitting. And it was a challenge. That was definitely a challenge. When I moved to BC, I also lost a lot of weight. I joined a food program, Weight Watchers, and lost a lot of weight, a significant amount. Um, my weight was actually down to a point that family were concerned. And that lasted about a year and a half, and then I went off, and all that weight came back really quickly.
Okay.
Uh,
So
and
the weight loss was happening through a diet, or was it just
no, it was through a diet. It was through Weight Watchers. So it was very rigid. And I got really obsessed with perfection, and um, that part of my personality hadn't shown up until then.
mm,
But it wasn't healthy for me. I was just way too obsessed with being precise and doing it exactly, and um to the point it caused some mental health issues. Like I really wasn't in good shape. When I went off Weight Watchers, it's like a backlash. It just came on back, all back on plus really quickly. And then that struggle has just gone on and on and on.
so
Uh,
so now it seems um so I'm pretty sure when we were working together you weren't drinking a bottle of wine a day.
no, I wasn't. No, I
And
wasn't. That was
but
in
the
my 20s.
right.
Yeah.
But so the struggles that have continued are more around the weight mainly. The rest of
That's
this.
that's really the only physical one that I still see. Like I think other than that, my lifestyle is pretty healthy. I can be more active, and when I'm eating well, I have the energy, and I just naturally become more active. Um, but it confused me. I couldn't figure out why I could do the other things,
Mm.
but I couldn't do the food thing.
Oh, that's interesting.
It just didn't make sense to me. I also didn't think of the food thing as an addiction. I thought of it as a habit. I had bad habits, and if I could just get my act together, that would take care
Interesting.
of it.
And uh, was you're not thinking about the food as an addiction? Was that, do you think, the way is talked about culturally, or is it something different about food as
I,
consumption, which is
I don't know that most people think of food as an addiction. I think it's seen as poor eating habits, poor choices. Um, yeah, that if people could just kind of get it together.
and but do you know why that is? Like, why do people think of it differently than, let's say, consuming one bottle of wine a day?
I think it's crept up on us culturally.
Hmm.
Like I don't like alcohol has always been an issue. Drugs are always an issue. Cigarettes weren't thought of as an addiction until that reality started to register. And research was being done, and there was recognition of the impact on health and lungs. And so with cigarettes, it's changed. When I started smoking, it wasn't seen as a big deal.
Okay.
And it's certainly not a health risk. So that changed over time. I think the same thing is happening with food now. I think there's research being done, and
Mm,
there's recognitions of what's happening culturally. Like if you look at Western culture and the change in our average weight,
mhm.
it's not what it was 50 years ago. It's not what it was 100 years ago.
Right.
Weight
Like,
issues were
right now,
unknown. Hmm?
sorry, I got you. What were you
I was
saying
just
there?
saying weight issues were pretty much unknown at that point. Yeah.
And I was, yeah, that's very interesting. The like what you're saying. I'm curious. Do you have a sense of why are weight issues more of an issue now in general compared to 50 years ago?
One of the things you talked about this program I'm doing, and it's focused on food addiction. That's the language that's being used. And the woman that started it is a Dr. Joan Ifland, Ifland. And she did a PhD on, I think it's nutrition addiction, or it's food, it's basically food addiction. And that was her focus. Running across her stuff has made a real difference for me in my attitude and my attitude towards myself. Because I would beat myself up pretty significantly about why everybody else could do this and I couldn't.
Mhm.
Um, Looking at her research and what she's pulled together, the obesity rate changed in the mid 80s.
Mm,
And what happened was the cigarette companies bought the food companies. The cigarette companies could see people were quitting and they were losing their market.
mm,
So they bought the food companies and they hired scientists to look at how you can combine sugar, salt, and fat
mm.
in the way that most activates brain centers.
Yes. Mm.
And if you look at a graph of obesity, it's gradually going up, and then in the 80s it just climbs. Um,
Interesting. That's
and
fascinating. I mean, and you think it's not so much also that the availability of food went up due to mass production of
absolutely, it
that's probably
absolutely. We're
also.
not we're not cooking at home the way we were. We're
Mhm,
buying these processed products. Um, People are busy. I mean, thinking about things like TV dinners today, that sounds really gross. But at the time it came out, it was considered amazing. Um,
mhm.
People didn't need to cook, you just heated it up and you know, but then there's all the additives that go into it.
Right.
There's all the preservatives, there's all the
Yeah.
yeah,
But at the time when TV dinners came out, they were considered like an exciting thing. People were buying them and and trying them out and
they were a
kind of the new fad.
convenience. They were a
Right.
convenience. Yeah. If
Um,
you think about the grocery stores today, and a lot of places they would talk about this. If you're shopping on the outside, like the produce and the dairy and the breads and stuff, that's different than what you get in the middle of the store. Um, another
hmm.
another thing
Like,
they talk,
and what's different? Sorry, can you elaborate on that?
well, an apple's
Uh,
not that
the,
processed. Like it might be genetically engineered. It might be I heard somewhere there when they look at developing apples, they're looking at crispness. People want their apples to be crisp and juicy. So that's the kind that they're developing. Yeah, the stuff in the middle, one of the things that also played into what's being added to food is corn syrup. And it was around the mid 80s that became readily available, and it's inexpensive for manufacturers.
Exactly.
So it gets added to everything,
Exactly. Yeah.
to a
And
lot of things.
do you have any insight around why, let's say, grocery stores would keep the less processed stuff on the outside versus the inside? Is there sort of a marketing thing around that, or?
I'm not sure about that. I really have no idea.
Hmm.
Part of it might be the coolers. That's I don't know, because that's the basic healthy foods tend to
Mhm.
be on that outside rim. Um,
That's interesting. This this also reminds me of a friend who was a farmer. He told me he went back and he said once to me that this is he reads history and things like that, and he was saying that this is the first time, according to him, what his sense is that this is the first time in history, or at least the last few hundred years, where people, especially in the West, have more choices in food than they can deal with. So if
yeah.
you go into the grocery store, you just have so much. We just have so much choice, and I think that plays something with their does something with their mind where we just don't know what to do with this much food because in the past we haven't had this much food available, and I think that's we get caught in weird food relationships and
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
interesting.
And true, on this continent,
Mm-hmm.
there's certainly an abundance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do think
So
it's more
yeah,
than that as
um,
well. Um, so for example, dairy has 4 types of morphine in it. Now, it's not anywhere near medical grade morphine. It's 20, 15 to 20% compared to medical, but it's enough to keep you coming back. It's
yeah,
mhm.
exactly. So um, so you're able to handle a lot of the other addictions, and then food has been ongoing a process for your journey for you in terms of.
So for example, with alcohol, I moved so that I wasn't with the people I had been drinking with. You don't have to go into a liquor store or a bar,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really hard to avoid food.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's so things like sugar, salt, and fat activate different parts of our brain in a pleasurable way. Like that's how we survived. It's a pleasurable experience. We can't not eat. If we have complete control of our food at home, we can keep it really, really clean and healthy. Once we're into restaurants, once we're into buying stuff away from home, it gets really difficult to find food
And
that isn't processed in some way. Um,
yeah, exactly. And then we're exposing ourselves to the additives and
yeah.
so I'm curious about. I mean, it's a big topic, but also around your journey around your relationship to self, and your as you were, you've been going through a journey around food. How
Mhm.
does that relate to your relationship to yourself, and what's changed over the years and evolved,
Um,
or what have you noticed?
there's a lot of shame around not having control. of myself. It's I mean, we get a lot of messages culturally. One of the things I've thought about is the issues with food, particularly around overweight, are so much more visible than others are. So I could drink every night, but walking down the street, no one knew that.
Mm-hmm.
Going to work the next day, I would appear to be fine. Once you're heavy, once you've added weight, you're not invisible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And your issues aren't invisible anymore. And there's a lot of shame attached to that. Like the setting we worked in, I had a really hard time being there because I thought I shouldn't be. It should be healthy people that are here.
Oh,
Um,
really? I didn't
yeah,
know that.
yeah. So it got painful. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I was doing was involved in a mindfulness program. And the mindfulness program had a yoga section attached to it.
Yeah.
And leading those yoga sessions was a nightmare for me. Um, I just, shame, the shame was overwhelming at times. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah. So, and just to let our audience know, so this was a clinical setting where there were therapists, and there were maybe 10 therapists in this team of clinicians and working with people with different mental struggles. And that's where you felt you didn't belong and had that shame come up.
yeah.
Yeah.
So every time that phase of that program would come around, I'd be struggling for weeks, just not
Really?
feeling like I
Oh,
should be there, and came really close to quitting a few times.
oh wow. Mhm.
Yeah.
So
So
was this um uh and the shame, I guess, as you were struggling, as the yoga sessions were approaching for this mindfulness group, could you tell us or tell me about the process you went through with the struggles? How did you relate to the shame coming up or the criticism coming up? Did you just sit through that, or um
there would be an internal struggle going on. The I can't quit, I've got a mortgage.
mm,
At the same time, I shouldn't be here.
mm,
And it should be somebody else doing this, not me. And so that back and forth
mm,
would just go on week after week. And
wow. Mhm.
then
And
that
what, yeah,
Mhm.
sorry, and was it also that anybody made comments or things which happened
Never,
which no.
never. It was what was happening. And because it had been an issue for most of my life, I was that shame groove was really well worn.
Mm.
It's a place I knew well. The yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm sure it came up in different addictions, the different struggles around, like the shame piece, the same.
No, not in the same way. It
Oh,
didn't.
okay.
It didn't. I quit drinking. I come from a family with a lot of alcoholism in our history. So I kind of felt like that when I came to naturally. Um,
Mhm.
and I did. The second time I drank, I was 17 and I was blackout drinking. Like there was no warm up. So it was just right into it. No, there wasn't shame in the same way. It was this had a different quality to it. And interestingly, it would be different today, but I was never bullied. I was
Mm.
never ridiculed. Those experiences that I hear people talking about now, I didn't have. Uh,
Okay.
and I'm not sure why, but I didn't.
yeah, and so that's a good point because people often attribute different struggles to these experiences like bullying and things, and you didn't have those, and yet you had the same similar struggles.
In high school, I would have been described as heavy, but not necessarily fat. I was on the school badminton team and volleyball team, and I lifeguarded for 3 summers. And
Mm,
so I was heavier than you would have expect, given that I was also athletic.
mm,
Um, but no, it was never the bullying, never, or the ridiculing.
right,
That's not quite true. At home, it was a struggle
right.
with particularly my mother. I did a I did a course. It was feminist counseling course in
Mm-hmm.
Ottawa. When I was back in Ontario with my mom, I took a course in Ottawa just to kind of keep the wheels turning. And I did I did a paper on raising a fat child in the 50s.
Oh wow.
It was absolutely fascinating. The articles in women's magazines and how it blamed mothers um,
Blame them
for their children being heavy.
uh,
It was really quite interesting, the attitude.
mhm,
Um, and I think I developed a little bit of compassion for my mom doing that program, that particular course, realizing the pressures that had been on her.
mhm.
Um, People assuming there was something she was doing wrong, and she wasn't. It was what I was doing.
And at the same time, I felt or at least I think that you growing up in that setting, obviously there was issues around your mom.
Mhm.
Um, like I'm curious about how did you, or over the years, how you made sense of the eating issues? Is it you? I know we've had some discussions around the shamanic work we've done. Is sometimes in life we have given certain challenges to work through. Sometimes they come very clearly from past experiences in childhood. Sometimes they're kind of unknown and mysterious. And so I'm curious about how you've made sense of this particular journey you've had this life.
When I think about where it started, I would say it was when I was about 6. I lived in a house with my mom, dad, my great grandfather, and a great aunt. And my great grandfather was alcoholic and senile. So there was an 80-year difference. So when he was 84, I was 4. Um, he was drinking, and there were dementia issues. So his touch was inappropriate. He didn't have
Okay.
that kind of. So he was also my best friend in the house.
Um,
He would walk to a corner store and buy me candy.
mm,
So that kind of connection started forming.
mm.
I remember being 6 the day of his funeral, and everybody left, and they left me with a neighbor, and the neighbor just kept feeding me cookies. And
Okay.
something in me transferred my feelings about him onto the food.
Oh,
And then that push-pull, the really good and the really bad, the back and forth, the um
what do you mean
form.
the really good and the really bad?
Well, he was
Oh, I see that.
kind to me, but he was also inappropriate. So there was that mixed mixed connection. Um,
Right.
yeah.
And when he was inappropriate as a child, I mean, that's a big topic in terms of
Mhm.
actually, but as a child, you felt that from him that there's something off here. And when the inappropriate touch was
There,
happening.
there there was a discomfort. Like I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel like I know some people have had absolutely horrendous experiences.
Mhm.
This wasn't that, it was more confusing, more not understanding what was happening and yeah.
And and while that was happening, he was also experiencing dementia and things were going on. Okay,
He
so
died when I was 6. So
right,
that was, yeah.
so that's quite fascinating that they fed you cookies and cookies after cookies, and then um,
So for me, there's two things. There's the psychological and the physical. Um, so the psychological stuff involves him and my dynamic with my mom. And then the physical, I think there truly is a physical addiction. Um, when the food activates these pleasure centers in the brain um, and I think there's different sensitivities. Like people have different sensitivities to alcohol. And I think there's different sensitivities to food. Yeah.
and by that you mean that some people will quickly maybe become addicted to salty foods or
Yeah.
or some level of salt in
Yeah.
foods.
I've watched children, like children under 5 who aren't in kindergarten yet. And sometimes you can see, like if you've got a bunch of little kids and they're having a snack, you can see the kids that are more excited, that
Mm.
it's not just snack time. It, it's like,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah. Yeah, that's
so
interesting, right? That people have different levels of,
yeah.
um, yeah, that's,
My
that's
my sister and I have laughed about this. Her husband is someone who eats to stay alive. Like he enjoys food, but he couldn't care less. And we're fascinated that that it's not something he's excited about. It's
mhm.
he enjoys it. He enjoys a good meal. It's not that he doesn't, but it's food.
Right.
It's not entertainment. It's not pleasure. It's not excitement. It's not craving. It's not desiring. It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And do you think that that also points to a certain kind of a personality type where some of us are more just more wired towards addictions or just kind of getting excited about like needing that for example, maybe if he's the kind of person who doesn't get excited about food, so maybe he wouldn't be excited about binge watching 10 hours of Netflix either. But some people are more just
Yes. Yeah.
more yeah.
That's interesting, the idea of binge watching and how that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sitting with what you said. I think there's a lot of richness and a lot of gravity in what you experienced. And um, I was thinking about the shame you talked about in the mindfulness group, and um, do you in your experience is shame similar or synonymous with a self-critical narrative inside of us? So
Absolutely.
absolutely, yeah. So there's this
Yeah.
critic. Um,
It's the critic is saying not good enough. Um, too heavy. Somebody leading a yoga session. I have an image of who that would be and what they would look like and
Mhm.
kind of where they are in their own journey, and I didn't fit that.
Mhm.
Um,
But at the same time, I can imagine that that critic was also because there is a chance, right? So if you're heavy and leading a yoga group, that somebody might make a comment that because of the cultural conditioning we have around body image and who
there
should
would
be lead.
there was certainly a fear of that.
Mhm.
Sometime playing out a script of someone being critical. It never happened. And again, I'm not sure why, but I know I was always braced for it. It was
Yeah, because because I've been working with the critic quite a bit with my clients these days, especially men
mhm,
who deal with depression and how the critic operates in us, and I include myself because I've experienced depression and a
mhm,
strong critic. So I've come to realize that part of the role of the critic is also to protect us,
yes.
and then so I wonder if that critic, the shame, was also partly, not all of it, but that be careful because there's a chance that somebody might say something. Anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I can remember running that script of somebody saying something, somebody being critical or judgmental, and just over and over kind of figuring out how would I handle that? How would I deal with that? And there was fear. There was a real kind of grip me fear around possibility of that happening. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm fascinated by the personal journeys we take, and knowing you leading a group, I would not never have thought that we would
Sorry,
be
I didn't hear that.
like because I was in these groups too, and for some time we had an overlap, so we were doing them together, and I would never have thought that you were experiencing shame, and so I just wanted to highlight how personal these journeys we take are, right?
Mhm.
And knowing, looking at somebody we just don't know what's what's going on and where they are.
Happening for them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna add to this, Arslan, is I think that's part of what's keeping me in this program I'm in now, is there's a lot of lifting of shame.
Mm.
Um, the motivation to change is getting stronger. I see myself like thinking about people sort of addiction theory. I can see myself going through some different stages around addiction in relation to food and one of the things this group talks about is mirror neurons. And so when you're spending time through Zoom with people with the same focus, who are all working towards the same goal, um, it's just I'm not as hard on myself as I used to be.
Mm.
It's I want to learn, I want to change, and I'm not beating myself up the way I used to. So, like I go into a grocery store now and I see it through different eyes.
Mm.
I don't see all the junk food as wonderful and great and oh yay, I get to have this. I see it as unhealthy and damaging.
Mm.
And that there's intent behind the companies in the same way the cigarette companies knew what they were doing.
Mm.
That's part of the huge lawsuits is they knew how damaging it was.
Mm.
And they were designing the cigarettes to be as addictive as possible. And they're doing the same with the food. So in some ways, I'm not as hard on myself as I used to be.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely to
Mhm. I
Yeah.
don't,
Sorry,
I'm,
go ahead.
I'm, I'm just thinking, I don't have a sense that addiction has been part of your life.
It has been. I mean, I had a porn addiction to pornography growing up,
Okay.
and that changed. Um, it's not a theme which occurs often in my life now, and when I say theme, meaning in general, like addictive. So, like in terms of food, I don't have that so much, and I'm more
But
like your. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
can see where pornography would be addictive because again, it would be stimulating brain centers and um, there would be a physical response that would be pleasurable.
Oh yeah, 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 for
So
sure.
that
And
that
it's
makes
yeah, it's
sense.
powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, food, pornography, the images, extremely powerful. And um, I do a water fast. I do just drinking water for ten
I
days, 12.
remember you
And
talking about that. Yeah.
yeah, and that resets for me the relationship to food, and um, yeah, it's sorry, I don't know why I said that, but that reminded me that
Oh,
there's a connection.
but we all have our relationship to food in some way, and to a
Hmm.
lot of different things. We don't necessarily all have to have a relationship with alcohol or cigarettes,
Right.
but we all have a relationship with food, whatever it is. For some people, it's a really positive, healthy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's true.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting that I had, and I knew my addiction in pornography, in porn was based on emotional disease. In growing up in my family, I what I experienced, and I needed that something to just help me feel better, and so I very clearly related to that. And then, um, but just in terms of how you describe your life, I didn't have the multiple different forms of wanting that that sort of
Mhm.
addictions playing that role. So it's interesting. I had one thing I feel happen that way, and then we're not a bunch of them. I didn't have
Yeah, yeah.
multiple. Um, and I think actually we can spend a whole session on that as well. But I think porn is such a big deal right now. Even when I work with my clients and especially young men, um, and it's again one of those things that's shame associated. It's not talked about very much.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just flying under the radar and all that. So
Well, and it's having such an impact on relationships.
yes, exactly. That's a very good
Oh,
point. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's huge. So, and
Mhm.
that's huge. And I can see it in my life how it affected my relationships, and a lot of the I'm still undoing so much that.
I'd be interested in talking about that. I'd be curious what your perspective is on it.
Yeah,
That's
I'll
great.
maybe next time we can.
Sure.
Um, one thing, I think we have some little bit of time left. I was just thinking about the um, so there's food, and then there's alcohol, and then there's marijuana or other things we can get addicted to, or binge watching, and um, for some reason I keep coming back to this sense of shame and self, the relationship to self. So because when we have shame, like you said, there's the critic, there's self-criticism, and self-criticism points to a relationship to self which is not compassionate, which is harsh. And I I'm just curious if you have insight around the different kinds of addictions you've dealt with and the commonality of that shame in all of them, and that healing that took place as a common denominator. Um, is that something you talk
Yeah,
about?
I'm kind of searching for how that all fits together. Um, with the drugs and the alcohol. So I quit I quit at 26 and there was a few slips, and by 30 I was completely done. Um I didn't feel shame in the same way because it was the norm of my peer group. What led to my quitting was, again, I come from a long line of alcoholics. And I had one of those epiphany where I wouldn't have been alive at 40 if I had kept going the way I was going. Um, I drunk driving, we didn't have the awareness in the 70s that we do now. And I came home from a party really drunk and almost caused a car accident with another car with a baby in it.
Mm.
So my reasons for quitting weren't, it had nothing to do with the culture. The culture actually was supporting what I was doing. It had to do with my own waking up, my own recognizing what I was doing to myself and potentially to other people, which is very different than the food.
So,
Um,
so when the culture is supporting or is not judging the addictive behavior, then the shame is different. The sense of shame is different.
I
And
felt it differently. Like I'm just as we're talking, I'm realizing I didn't tell my friends how much I was drinking.
mm,
Um, we knew what we were all doing on weekends when we were partying, but I wasn't telling them I was drinking every day or doing
mm,
drugs every day. Although they probably knew because they were buying it for me.
mm,
Not the alcohol, but the hash oil. I went
right,
through a lot of hash oil.
mm,
Um, yeah, I think I didn't have the awareness. I think when I think about being 25 and what I was doing, the drinking, the drugs, the cigarettes, the food, the coffee, I don't know how I was standing. Like I truly don't. But I was numb. So I wasn't
mm,
feeling things
right.
with the intensity that I do now. Um, it-
And yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was a lot of, like you said, 10 cups of coffee and 2.5.
and there wasn't, it was the norm of my peer group. So my friends in Toronto were friends I had met at school, at university in residence, and we all partied. I
Mm,
don't, in hindsight, I don't know that I was extreme,
right.
as much as, well, I was, because I knew what I was doing that they didn't know I was doing. Yeah.
But the but I imagine, even though the shame isn't strong, let's say you're drinking and the culture is condoning that, or just everybody's doing it at the same time. I imagine at the I imagine a person. I don't know if I'm right or wrong in assuming that, but I imagine a person who's drinking a lot or smoking a lot, or even though society is okay with it, I wonder their sense of self, this relationship to self, is a kind one or not. Can you be a self-compassionate person and be doing that, or what's your sense?
I'm not as hard. I mean, I go through the shame and I go through the self-judgment and the kind of that internal critic. It's not vicious like I hear other people talking about.
Mm,
Um, like it's not a name calling, it's a why are you doing this? What are you doing? Why can't you stop? What is it
this
about? What's wrong with you that you can't stop? But
uh,
it's not really putting me down in a um
pejorative way.
yeah, yeah. And no,
And,
internally I don't have that kind of dialogue.
oh, interesting. And this is in relation to the food, or in general.
Anything.
Okay,
I
that's interesting.
sometimes I sometimes think I'm too gentle. Like
Ah,
I sometimes think maybe if I was a little harder on myself,
Hmm.
things would be different.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting because for me, in my addiction journey, the self-critic was very, very strong. And
Yeah.
in general, so maybe not just related to addictions, but
Mhm.
yeah, name calling and really affecting the somatic, the body. So when that critic came on, I could just feel the heaviness and
Yeah.
lethargy and kind of yeah. So it's interesting, the different tone for critics.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's not vicious, it's not name calling, it's not. When I think about my mom and I fought a lot. We we were loud, um, but we weren't mean. So it's I don't know if that internal voice just didn't develop in that way. Because again, it sounds ridiculous, but I have wondered if I would have been better off, if I would be better off if that internal critic was harsher.
Or when you say harsher, meaning it was more demanding of you, or more
Yeah,
more.
yeah.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting.
It peaks like around the yoga, but again, it wasn't mean. It was, yeah, I don't even really know how to describe it. It was more the what's wrong with you, but not answering that. Like not what's wrong with you, you're this, that part wasn't there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's fascinating. I think yeah, we can maybe spend some time talking about that
Yeah.
because it's very interesting. And for me, because the reason I'm also interested in the critic is that because I feel the critic is um, for me, it's a internalized parent, and a parent I formed because there wasn't a better parent available outside of me, so I formed this.
Yeah.
And the way the critic, like you're saying, I wish it was harsher, and sometimes I wish it's just fascinating. It's just interesting to me how the critic motivates me to do life and then stops me from doing other parts of life, and how I motivate myself in relation to a critic.
Mhm.
It's quite fascinating because we need that motivator inside of us, but then what kind of voice is there, and
Yeah.
how is it motivating?
I hadn't really put that together, but the critic does stop me from doing a lot of things.
Hmm.
The like the yoga, you shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
That's not for you, that's for other people. So that comes up a lot.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a good discussion, you think?
Yes. We covered a lot.
Yeah, we covered
I did a lot of talking today. Yeah.
oh, it was great. Like I think yeah, and I think as I was going along, I could feel that richness, and also wondering or wanting to spend an hour on different topics which were coming up.
We can backtrack and expand and stretch.
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Um, and just before we go, Leanne, in a nutshell, could you just spend 1 minute talking about the course you're taking? Like, what's the name or how many sessions it is, so just people know what course it is.
Okay. If people were interested, if they did a YouTube search for Dr. Joan Ifland, Ifland, um, and I'm trying to think of the official name. So there's a program that it's a business. It's not voluntary. So there is a cost involved. Um, it's about equivalent to Weight Watchers. So it's not extreme. It focuses on our relationship to food, and it focuses on coping mechanisms. So there's meditation, there's tapping, there's a lot of discussion about mirror neurons and looking at forming community. There's Zoom meetings 17 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
where you can go, and one of the things that has kept me there is, and this comes involves the shame, is if you go to an AA meeting with people who are alcohol involved, they tell each other stories that they wouldn't tell anywhere else. And this is very similar. You hear people telling their stories of what their life has been like in relationship to the food. And they're not stories you would tell anyone else. Um, again, the shame and um, but we recognize each other. And for me, it was sort of like, yes, I belong here. I fit here. Um, I would certainly encourage people to take a look at it. So there's that program. And then I'm doing, on top of that, I'm doing a training program to work as a facilitator. Um, that's a bit more involved. Yeah. The resources are amazing. There's hundreds of hours of videos and um on a whole range of topics. If somebody is dealing with food issues, it's worth taking a look at. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So let's wrap up for today, if that's okay.
Okay.
And I'll stop the video recordings. And if you want to stay online for a few minutes, we can talk.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for listening, everybody, and hope to see you next session.